Good evening, everybody. It's March 31st, 2022. Welcome to tonight's meeting of the Gig Harbor Planning Commission. My name is Chair Greg Huxema. We will start off by taking roll. Commissioner Soltis.
Here.
Commissioner Bradbury.
Here.
Commissioner Krozik.
Here.
Commissioner Greiner. She is here, but having trouble with her audio. Commissioner Bennett.
Here.
Commissioner Brown. Commissioner Brown, can you hear me?
Mute toggle not checked.
Commissioner Greiner, can you hear me? Okay. We can't hear you. Is the microphone on your computer turned off by chance?
You can click on the arrow next to mute and it will give you options for selecting a microphone. Sometimes there's multiples.
Yeah, down in the left-hand corner of the screen. No, still not.
You can call in too with the link that was sent out. Commissioner Brown, were you able to hear us?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Okay. So Commissioner Brown is obviously here. Thank you. And I will wait a minute still while Commissioner Greiner tries to get things sorted out, since we have an important meeting going on or about to. In the meantime, we also have two Gig Harbor residents, I believe, listening in with us tonight. Thank you very much for attending. We always appreciate that. I would like to just remind you that this is not a public hearing, so there is no public comment. And if you would also please refrain from doing any Zoom chatting during our meeting, that would be appreciated.
Zoom webinar.
In addition, before we get started, I would like to thank all of the commissioners for your extra time this month. This is a third meeting in the month, but this is an important topic. We usually only have two meetings for those who are listening. And I really appreciate that y'all are willing to volunteer your extra time this month for an additional meeting so that we can keep this topic of the short-term rentals moving along on behalf of the citizens of Gig Harbor. So thank you very much for that. And thanks to the staff also, because I know that means extra work and extra time for you as well. And with the staff, we have Carl DeSimas and Michelle Thomas. So first item on the agenda this evening is to approve the minutes of our meeting of March 17th. First, any
I move we accept the minutes as written.
moved by Bradbury and seconded by Commissioner Bennett. All those in favor or any discussion about the minutes? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Okay, so let's get right into the meat of things here this evening. And Carl, I'll let you take over and lead the discussion of our follow-up about the study of the short-term rentals in Gig Harbor.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. I appreciate that. And again, I would like to also say that that your work and diligence on this topic is really appreciated, and all the submissions that you provided to staff in order to help us pull this kind of draft ordinance together was really great and really appreciated. So thank you very much for that. And I'd also like to note that we had to extend the moratorium on lodging level 1. We sort of run out of time with the original moratorium. So council did pass ordinance 1484 on Monday night. That will become effective here, I believe, tomorrow. And also council thanked the Planning Commission and staff for all the work that we've done so far. They recognize that this is a difficult subject. They appreciate the fact that we need more time to get this done. And want to see, of course, a good product come out of it. So everybody's on the same page with that. The other thing I wanted to note is that there is some hope that we can get a first reading of an ordinance to the city council in June 9th. So we've kind of got a little bit, even though we have the moratorium has been extended for 6 months, everyone would like to kind of see us get it finished, as soon as possible. I think that we would like to do that as well. So, I don't think anybody's off on a different page on that either. And I think that we can certainly get there. So I just wanted to throw that out. So for this evening, we did what we said we were going to do. So we took all of your comments, all of the public comments that we've received, information that was provided, and I made an effort at taking all of those and creating sort of an amalgam of them into this draft code. And really, I put this into a code format just because it was easier for me to organize my thoughts that way. But it may not be, of course, that we end up with something that looks like this, that looks like, chapter 17 dot whatever it might be, short-term rentals. These could be regulations that we put under in the conditional use permit code, for instance, where we also deal with accessory dwelling units. So it could be that the regulations are put in there under a subsection or something like that. So certainly this format, nobody's married to this. If nobody agrees that we should go this direction and have an entirely new chapter just dealing with short-term rentals, we could find another place in the code to put them. But that's something that we can deal with down the road. So hopefully, and I'll be interested to hear the commission's thoughts on the format of how we pulled these thoughts and comments together, and whether or not it was user friendly for you. I know I'd originally thought that maybe it would be a table with all of the thoughts and comments in it, but as I started to get into it, it seemed to me like that was just sort of foregoing or prolonging the inevitable that we need to start getting some stuff on paper. So and I think to Commissioner Brown's point that having a straw man that we can work from is a good idea, and I think he was exactly right. So that's what we attempted to do here, and hopefully that worked for you all. There are two sort of three chapters that we've identified: the definition, and then the new chapter for short-term rental, and then we also have kind of an effort at chapter 1714 when talking about the use table. And again, for anybody who's listening and for the commission's benefit, these are, this is all very rough draft, just sort of spitballing ideas. Again, just trying to pull all of the different ideas together and put them in a place where we could have a better discussion about them. So with that, Chair, I think it probably behooves us to just sort of jump in to the documents. And my idea was that we would maybe run through the version of the document either in Word or in PDF format and just go through point by point. But if I could, I'd like to turn it back over to you and maybe the commission for any kind of feedback or any sort of general feedback that you want to give to me, just in case we're completely off base, because I'm making a lot of assumptions here. So I don't want to get too far down the road and then find that no, everybody thinks this is hogwash and we need to go back to the drawing board.
Okay, thanks for that intro. And my comment would be that looking at everybody else's input, several of us came to the same conclusion, and you alluded to it a bit there. And that is, I think we had a lot of discussion at the last meeting that may have felt a bit haphazard at times because there were just a lot of ideas flying around. But nonetheless, I felt that it served a useful purpose because it stimulated a lot of thought and gave people something to chew on, hearing different people's points of view. But now that we've been through that, I think, what you're suggesting is what we ought to do. We just need to start marching through the points that everybody has brought up and start saying we support that or we don't support that. And it needs to be in there or it doesn't need to be in there. And I think once we do that, then the new ordinance is just going to write itself.
Greg, I think that you prepared an excellent memo here with regard to various points that could be in the ordinance. And I went through all of the comments from the other commissioners and kind of saw where we might have some general agreement. For example, I think everybody agreed that off-site parking needs to be available. And I'm wondering if we could use your memo as a template for the discussion tonight and just start going through these one by one. Then that gives Carl something to place into his rough draft ordinance that he can begin putting together for us. And then in addition, I identified about 10 other issues that were raised by the other commissioners that weren't on your list that I put at the end of your list that we can also discuss, and we can bring them up when we get down to the end of the list.
Okay. How do the rest of you feel? I see some heads nodding. Commissioner Brown, go ahead.
In addition to what we have just discussed, I want to recommend that we consider the entire package that we send to the council, not just the ordinance, but I think we ought to consider transmitting it with an executive summary, with some history and background information, so that they can kind of get a sense of the ground we've already plowed here. And I've submitted a draft of a straw man of that kind of a transmittal. So I'll be lobbying for that as we proceed and get closer to finishing our deliberations.
Okay, yeah, that's an excellent point. And that is typically done. And we had a little bit of a discussion at the last meeting. Like when this is forwarded on, the staff will propose a letter for my signature, which I then review, which does exactly what you just described when we're sending something forward and marches through that history. That just happened on what was that we just did recently, Carl? That anyway, the last one that went forward to the council.
Shoreline Master Program.
I think
Well,
it was
anyway.
art.
The arts.
Yeah. It was the consultant that we worked with. Anyway, point is, they submit an idea. I had some suggested changes with that. Carl said, right on. and made those modifications, and then I put my signature to it, and that becomes exactly what, I don't know if you call it a cover letter or an executive summary, or what the language that you use when you then take that to council, Carl.
Well, typically, so in a legislative process, which this is, and I know what you're referring to, Chair, from before, was the urban growth area analysis that we sent forward, but that wasn't an actual recommendation because it wasn't really not really a legislative process on that one. This one would be a formal recommendation from the commission to council, and I think, to Commissioner Brown's point, if we certainly can and have in the past submitted additional information as part of that, as part of the recommendation, in addition to the draft ordinance, if there's other background materials or other research that was done that the commission would like the council to consider as part of the recommendation, then we can certainly forward that along as well. No problem.
But I think it's a good point, Commissioner Brown.
And then to Commissioner Krosick's suggestion of going through either the chair's comments or others' comments, I wonder if it wouldn't be more beneficial to go through the draft that we've prepared with all of the comments and questions on the side, because the idea was to try and capture those areas where we have overlap and some areas where there might be questions, and then maybe come back through and do that survey and see what may have been missed, or vice versa. I mean, we can do it either way, I suppose. I'm not sure which way is more efficient.
I agree with that proposal, Carl.
Commissioner Greiner, can you hear us and be able to speak to us now?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Victory.
Yeah, if in doubt, go back to the headphones.
There you go.
I was trying to use the space bar earlier and look what happened.
There you go. Yeah, it didn't work for me a while ago too, and then all of a sudden, bam! I was pretty excited about it. So,
Hey, Greg, I have no problem doing it either way. I've kind of logged these. I try to find things that sounded familiar from different presentations, and there are, like John said, there's a lot of overlap. We can probably just position a lot of things at one time, but I wonder, do we need to address something right away that's kind of the more important thing, like whether we're going to do a ban on anything or whether we're going to limit anything? Because it seems to me if we have that discussion and disposition one way, that will inform some of our other discussions here. They seem like kind of the big issue to me we got to kind of grapple with, and then we're talking details after that.
Yeah, Commissioner Soltis, I think it's a fantastic point, and I tried to capture a little bit of that as well in the draft. And let me just share my screen really quick and just show you where I would kind of start from with this and see if, because I think this may get to that. Is that sharing? No.
Zoom
There it is.
webinar.
Is that sharing?
yes.
Okay. So yeah, I think I tried to hit on that right off the top here. And within the definition itself, and the first note I made was that there were some commissioners were discussing excluding some types of housing and ownership. That gets to part of your point. I think it's not the whole point. Down lower, I started to get into this idea of different categories of short-term rental, which is something that some commissioners had talked about. We heard some commenters talk about it, and a lot of the other jurisdictions' ordinances kind of divided things up that way. and of course, we can completely go away from that idea altogether. And we certainly would go away from that idea if we decided to exclude certain types of uses from the ordinance. And so I think if that's where everybody wants to start, we can certainly kind of tackle that right off the top here, right in the definition. And really quick, for just as a disclaimer here, this definition comes right out of the RCW. This is in 2019, the state passed 64.37, the RCW, that is relative to short-term rentals. And it provides some guidance, but not a lot of detail. You know, it wouldn't be something I don't think we could just bring in whole cloth and feel completely happy about. But it does provide this definition, which is fairly extensive. You're muted, Commissioner Brown.
Hey, Carl, before you say, Commissioner Brown, Carl, could you, the screen share is pretty small. Can you go to full screen and probably even enlarge it?
Let me see. Why would that be?
That's Shannon.
Yeah. All right, let me stop that and try again here. See if I can get this right.
I believe you can click to the left of it as well and zoom in as a viewer.
Let me see here if I do that again.
Webinar.
Are you seeing the Word document again?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me see if I can.
And I appreciate your point, Michelle, and I've been able to do that in the past, but it looks like I haven't been able to do it this. And it's typically when he screen shares, the document occupies the whole screen. And right now I'm getting everything that's on his computer.
Try it a different way here. Screen 1, screen 3.
Zoom webinar.
Better?
That's worse. 'Cause
It's
now
worse.
2 pages instead of 1, so it's gotten smaller.
Oh, geez. Okay.
Is everybody else having the same problem?
Yes.
I have a view options at the top of my screen that if I click on it, I can zoom in on it. I don't know if you guys have that or not.
Yes, that is an availability.
Oh yeah, I just did that and pushed 100% and it got 100% better.
Does everybody see that option at the top there?
No, where is it?
It's the very top right corner. It says view.
I can't quite read it.
Mine says you are viewing Carl DeSima's screens in green, and then right next to it, it says view options and a black box with an arrow.
Got it.
Okay.
Now, of course, it's so big that I can't see all of it at once.
Okay, well, I can maybe, if I turn this back down again, it'll be better.
Closer, closer. Yeah,
And then if I go to one page here, maybe that'll be better too.
Yeah, you see a zoom symbol here? Wait a minute.
You weren't even Carl.
View options, all right.
Screen share viewing options.
yeah, that looks pretty good on my screen, Carl.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry about that. Sorry about this, you guys. It's as many times as we've done this, there's still some hiccups, I guess.
Okay. So Commissioner Krosik, you have your hand up?
Yes, if we want to start out with what should we eliminate, which I think is a good place to start. Carl's got listed 4 items there. I think those should all be excluded from the types of things that we can use for short-term rentals. And then I think there were 2 others that I picked up in the material that you all submitted. And one was exclude short-term rentals from the historic areas. And let's see, what was the other one? Now I lost the other one. I'm sorry about that, but maybe the others could chime in too on what they feel should be excluded.
Well, what are we defining as a short-term rental? Carl, could you just state that in simple language?
Yeah,
What-
so we're saying that it's anything that is not a hotel, motel, or bed and breakfast that is in a dwelling unit and that is offered for fewer than 30 consecutive nights. That's the simple definition now, and that's what most jurisdictions definitions say. And I think you probably all read that as well, that, you know, they all sort of just qualify it as any rental unit, any dwelling unit that's being rented for less than 30 days. But the state's definition goes a bit further and then talks about what is not included as a short-term rental, which is kind of interesting and something that we definitely have to think about, because the first one of those items is that it states that a dwelling unit that is occupied by the owner for at least 6 months during the calendar year and in which fewer than 3 rooms are rented at any time is not considered a short-term rental. So that would exclude all of those homes where people are sort of snowbirding, in other words.
I can't see the value of excluding those.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's any value and ultimately they're not really excluded. However, they couldn't be considered a short-term rental. So they, you know, if we were to come up with a short-term rental permit, for instance, we wouldn't be able to permit a house where the owner lived in it for 6 months out of the year. So they would be sort of outside of that. And if they came in for a business license for that short-term rental, or if their neighbors wanted to complain that they were running a short-term rental, then they would be essentially running that business illegally within our city boundaries. Now, I know that there were at least a couple of commissioners discussed this idea of a time limit or some limitation on how many days an owner had to actually occupy the premises. And I think that gets to this point. I think that's what the state was contemplating as well when they were thinking about this. And so that's kind of what they came up with here.
There's multiple, if I could just there are multiple other cities who have used the number, I can't remember if it's 270 or 275 days a year that the owner has to occupy the residents.
Right,
Yeah.
and that would work for everyone but our friend, the fisherman, who says he's gone 4 months of the year, many years. So I would be, on that point, I would be in favor of making it less than 275 days, making it 8 months, 240 days. Simply to accommodate someone who has that kind of a residency pattern.
Yeah, if we want to go less than this definition, and here's the other thing is that I think, a lot of these jurisdictions that have come up with these short-term rental ordinances probably were either working on them at the time that this RCW was written, because this was just passed in 2019, or it was just previous or just prior to this. So that's something that we'd have to sort of suss out, I think, with the city attorney to find out, to make sure that we're legally defensible if we want to go with something that is greater than.
I agree with Commissioner Brown. I want to accommodate the fishermen also, so I would go with a definition that accommodates that individual.
At
Well,
least.
I don't want to, I really am reluctant to go down the path of we're trying to satisfy the needs of one person who, again, I don't think even lives within the city limits of Gig Harbor. I think we need to stay focused on what is best for all the residents of Gig Harbor and decide on a number. And if we think that there are others like that, then, I think the discussion is what's the right number of days of, residency requirement. But yeah, I'm just reluctant to go down recognizing the folks that gave input and trying to write an ordinance to them. Commissioner Bennett?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Greg just said. And I kind of am just trying to figure out in my own head and wonder what you guys think also. What are the implications and the difference between 6 months, 8 months, and 4 months? What does that mean for the rental or the ownership? What does that say about the person who's renting out that space? Like, I'm not sure I understand that their occupation by those amounts of months and what the implication is on that rental. And I'm curious what you guys' opinions on that is.
I personally don't think it's significant. I would support beginning with the state definition of the short-term rental.
And this is the and this is the minimum 6 months. It does state it's at least 6 months. So the idea here is that if it's owner occupied for 6 months or more, then it would not meet the definition of a short-term rental. In other words, it has to be used the majority of the time, the majority of the year, it needs to be used as a short-term rental in order to meet that definition.
But that ignores my spare bedroom, which I rent out, right?
So it's a dwelling unit that is occupied by the owner for at least 6 months during the calendar year and in which fewer than 3 rooms are rented at any time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, this language actually is a little, it's like a double negative.
It kind of, yeah, it's not, I didn't write it. This is verbatim right out of the RCW. So I just, this was a copy and paste here. I take no credit.
I think we could do better than that definition. I really do.
Well, how about this? What if I can check with the city attorney and find out what are, what legally we can do, if, as far as amending this definition, but still falling within the parameters of state law, not falling outside of the state law guidance. But I guess what would we want to? Would we want to just eliminate the whole idea of section B? That I've just highlighted there? Or is that going too far?
Screen share viewing options.
I kind of
mean-
like that. I kind of like that suggestion.
That's where I went originally when I was pulling this out of the RCW. I kind of debated whether to even include that second part because I thought it was kind of confusing. And it turns out it is, because I'm glad I'm not the only one confused on that, because it is confusing. We could look into the legality of that and make sure that we're not, if the commission wants to go that route.
Hey, I still cannot read that text, and I'm clicking on view options, and that's not providing me with any help. What I'm looking at the zoom options, I see zoom ratio, fit to window, request remote control, exit full screen, side by side. What do I do to make that text larger?
On my screen, Tom, there is below fit to window, there is 50%, 100%, 150%, 200%, and then the request remote control.
There might be a drop down for the zoom ratio. That's probably what you're looking for.
I see it. All right. There we go.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I can read it now.
So how do the commissioners feel about that? If I do a little exploration on that with the city attorney to find out what sort of wiggle room we have legally with this definition.
Yeah, I agree. I don't like the way the state has defined it. I like Tom Brown's definitions better. The ones that he put in his February 23rd memo.
Okay, I can look into that.
Screen share viewing options.
Do we want to review that definition, or should we move on and talk a little bit about where Commissioner Krosik had started with these ideas over here under exclusions?
Well, how easy is it for you to bounce back and forth? If it's, I think if we march through this document first, then we can circle back to the other. I mean, I agree. We just need to start knocking these things off.
Okay. Brown definition. So to Commissioner Krosik's point about what the other items were that were brought up for exclusion, I had made a note down here when I was talking about short-term rental category 2 and the restriction on the number of units. And there was some discussion about not allowing short-term rentals in the city's mapped Oh, actually, it was in the historic district, and I think Millville was brought up as well. Those both fall within the city's mapped height restriction area, which is kind of the city's view basin. And so that would encapsulate all of those areas, the historic district, Millville, Finholm. And so I think that is where you were going, Commissioner Krosick, with your thoughts.
Yeah, that would be fine.
Right. And John, I think one of the other things that slipped your mind, and maybe this is what you remember, because I had suggested considering not allowing STRs to be in any residence that has any sort of tax subsidy or tax, what's the word? Like the senior communities that don't have to pay school taxes.
That's right.
That just doesn't feel right to me. That you can have that kind of a benefit and then be able to have a short-term rental. So I'm interested in what other folks' thoughts are about that.
I agree with you, Greg.
I would agree as well.
It's really the same thing with the tiny houses, you know, that the point of tiny houses, especially as we look down the line of other things coming our way, is some of that is going to be intended for affordable housing. And so I don't, you know, I feel especially strongly about a tiny house, with the exception of a single tiny home that's an ADU on an individual's, you know, property. So one residence, one tiny home, they build the tiny home with the intent of having as an STR, but in that case, it's really an ADU, not a tiny home. But
Screen share viewing options.
I don't think that STRs have any place in anything that is designed or meant to be or intended to be affordable housing.
Is there a definition that we have between, say, a tiny house and ADU that would give us that difference, or is that something that we would need to put in here to define the difference between those, the affordable housing versus the backyard ADU that I want to rent out or something like that?
Yeah, we would need to find a definition for that. We don't have a tiny house definition within the code. You know, we have, and we don't really have ADUs either. We have accessory apartments, which kind of what we called them before ADU was coined. And we have a definition for accessory apartments, and those can be both within a dwelling unit, like an apartment, obviously, and or detached.
Okay.
And there's a limitation on their size. I think it's 600 square feet. They're limited to 600 square feet.
I'm pretty sure that's correct, Carl.
Carl, when we're talking about the short-term rental of bedrooms, for example, how does that differ from the definition of a bed and breakfast?
I know that is a tough one. They're very similar. A bed and breakfast, though, has the connotation that they are owner occupied, that the business owner is, you know, they're basically running a small hotel out of their house. So they are different in that regard, in that typically a short-term rental is, you know, when you think about a short-term rental, you typically think about a dwelling unit where you're renting out the whole home, or you're renting out the entire apartment, and that's yours. Correct. For that stay. Bed and breakfast, generally you're staying in a room in someone's home, and they're serving you breakfast in the morning. That's in the traditional sense. I know that's been changed, and that line, I think, has been blurred now with all of these the vacation rental market getting so big. But you know, and that's really what lodging level 1 was meant to be. When you read the definition, that's how they were breaking that down. Lodging level 1, 2, and 3, they were thinking about bed and breakfast. They were thinking about motel and hotel. And so the best we could do when short-term rentals started to become a thing and people were asking us about them and how to permit them, we put them in that lodging level 1 category because they're closely aligned, most closely aligned with bed and breakfast.
I think also, Carl, in Gig Harbor, a bed and breakfast has to have a business license. And I think part of that is related to, for example, what the IRS calls a business. And if you are materially involved in running the business, or if you serve food, then you have to be considered a bed and breakfast, I believe. And whereas with the STR, you don't have to have a business license. But depending on how intimately you're involved with it, you might have to be, and the IRS might consider that you have a business. So it's pretty, it's pretty murky waters.
Are you sure about that business license statement, Greg? I thought that a lot of STRs had to get business licenses in a lot of the reading that I've seen. Is that not the case in Washington?
I believe that they do have to have a business license, and I believe that they do have to be, that they need to be taxed in a certain manner. And I'm looking at the RCW right now. It states that short-term rental operators must remit all applicable local, state, and federal taxes unless the platform does this on the operator's behalf. Includes occupancy, sales, lodging, and other taxes, fees, and assessments to which an owner or operator of a hotel or bed and breakfast is subject in the jurisdiction in which the short-term rental is located. So that would lead me to believe that they must have to have a business license in order to be taxable. Also, back to the original question here about definitions. In these definitions for short-term rentals, at the state level, they have a definition of dwelling unit. Means a residential dwelling of any type, including a single-family residence, apartment, condominium, cooperative unit, or room in which a person may obtain living accommodations for less than 30 days, but not including duly licensed bed and breakfast, inn, hotel, motel, or timeshare property. So in that way, they're making an exclusionary statement about bed and breakfast, inns, hotels, motels, and timeshares. They're excluding those from, they're separating those out from STR.
Okay. So back to these exclusions again one more time. So everybody's kind of agreeing at this point that if it's possible, we should exclude these 6 categories from STR. In other words, we're prohibiting these categories from the ability to conduct short-term rental on their premises.
Yes.
And so just so everybody knows that number 5, where we're talking about the historic area, the height restriction area. That includes all of the downtown business district. It includes Millville. It includes Finholm. It actually includes quite a ways up the hill too, from all the way up to Bay Ridge. And
how do you justify excluding the historic district and letting all the other residential areas be subject to STRs? What do you tell the rest of the community? Why this community and not that one?
Webinar.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Commissioner Soltis, and that in most places, whether it is palatable or not, the most desirable place for a visitor to look for an STR would be right smack dab in the middle of the walking part of Gig Harbor. And so I don't think I can support a restriction in all of those areas. I think we can write an ordinance with enough other guidelines, regarding density and those sorts of things, and total number, or however we're going to restrict it. But to have an absolute restriction in those areas doesn't make sense to me and doesn't feel right.
Well, if I may, let me answer the original question. Why should they be treated differently? And my belief is they should be treated differently because the streets are narrow in those areas in many cases. There are no sidewalks in many cases. The lots are narrow, which means that there are more driveways per foot, which means that street parking is more congested. And I think the other, maybe the overriding reason why they should be treated differently is that that area is essentially built out. There's not room for other houses. Many of those dwellings are historic and are part of the charm of our neighborhood. So I think there are reasons why they're different, and we should consider those. And I would be in favor of restricting non-owner occupied STRs out of that area.
Now that's an idea I could support.
Well, that's great. We've made some progress. How do others feel on that compromise?
I can accept that.
I can also. I feel like the parking situation is probably no different than in other places, in that they need to have a specific parking spot. That will be covered in other parts of this, in terms of they can't rely on street parking for having an STR as part of a home in the historic area. So hopefully that would be something that wouldn't be an issue. You're not going to have 16 cars lined up for a particular house at some time. But that would make sense to have a non-owner occupied caveat to it.
I can't see my picture, so I don't know if I'm on mute or not.
No, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
So, well then, why wouldn't you do a ban on the whole city for non-owner occupied STRs? Why just do it for the historic district? I mean, I'm just looking at across the whole community. Yeah, it's great for Millview and all those really nice houses, but maybe it makes sense to ban it across the whole community. If you're going to ban it in one spot, why not the whole city?
I think that would be my feeling as well. I'd like to see a citywide ban on non-owner occupied short-term rentals.
And I agree with that.
I think it would be more appropriate to place limitations on them, percentage, specific number, or distance from one another. And I'm talking about a pretty significant distance here, not a couple of city blocks. They are not the kind of business that I would want to see exist in a large number, but there are benefits to allowing this business to have a presence in the community.
So I
Yeah,
think,
I'm not- Sorry.
sorry, Commissioner Soltis, go ahead.
I'm not hard over on, a community-wide ban, but I think you've got to be really kind of mindful of, fair and equitable treatment across the community. If you can set up a limitation, like Larry says, it's something fair and reasonable, but not absolute, maybe that's okay. But yeah, I don't think anybody's probably going to be super happy about getting a couple of short-term rentals next to them, no matter where they are in the community. But anyway, I'm not hard over on my position. I just wanted to make sure that we understood the logic of doing it in one area and not the rest of the community.
I think it's a good point, Commissioner Soltis, and I guess where my head goes a little bit is if we were to ban non-owner occupied short-term rentals throughout the city, then I guess the question would come up about the real difference between a bed and breakfast and a short-term rental. We're already sort of grappling with that a little bit, I think. But if we were to ban them across the city, then do we have any need for a short-term rental ordinance at all? And could we not just continue to go on with what we've got under lodging level 1? So I think that might be that could be another question for me. Maybe another research project for me to figure out what truly suss out what the difference between bed and breakfast and short-term rental is. I mean, this definition excludes bed and breakfast from a short-term rental. So they're basically, the state is looking at them completely and totally separately. But this definition also does say that a portion thereof, so it's a dwelling unit or a portion thereof. So that would lead me to believe that you could have an owner occupied short-term rental. I just don't know exactly what the difference is between a bed and breakfast and a short-term rental, and that's in the true sense.
Well, one difference that we've discussed is limiting the number of bedrooms that can be rented in a short-term rental to 1 or 2 or some small number. There is not any such limitation for a bed and breakfast, as I understand it.
Yeah,
Well-
that could very well be it.
Yeah, and I'm not. I was trying to read and understand this question as I was looking at and studying this issue, and there's a number of things, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't profess to be, but my understanding is that, for example, if you own a bed and breakfast, there are specific benefits, or first of all, there's specific requirements that go along with that. And part of it is the material. Again, you have to provide material support. It's part of your home. You can actually take a tax deduction for part of it, for the upkeep, if you're making improvements in one of those rooms and so on. And there's specific forms that you have to fill out when you file your taxes. If you have rental income from a short-term rental, there's a different form that you have to fill out with regard to your taxes, and you can't, and so there are also some benefits you can get with that as well. So it becomes pretty complicated, but there is, as far as the IRS is concerned, there is a difference between these two animals.
Mhm.
And for a non-owner occupied STR, for example, that is considered an investment property. And so then that's a different place that you file on your income taxes with that. And so there are nuances that I can't articulate here. But I read about them and I was like, oh, okay, now I get it. But trying to explain it to y'all now, it's more difficult because it's not what I do for a living. But I could easily be swayed to say that in Gig Harbor city limits, the thing that makes sense for our town is it has to be owner occupied to have a short-term rental permit in our city. That we don't want to just protect the fabric and fiber of historic downtown Millville, the waterfront, all those great places, Finn Homes. Everybody comes to Gig Harbor for a specific reason. And it's to avoid the things that some of them are fleeing California, some of them are fleeing places that used to be cool and aren't cool anymore because they've been taken over by short-term rentals. So but there's also cities all over the country that have limitations in specific areas with regards to short-term rentals that they don't have in other areas of the city. So I suppose I could be swayed that way as well, but admittedly there's not a whole lot of room anywhere in Gig Harbor for a lot more density.
I would support the idea of some restriction in these areas that you just mentioned. But on a broader look, if we place restrictions on non-owner occupied short-term rentals, as well as owner occupied short-term rentals in the entire city limits, you could state those in such a way that in that entire area of Millville and Finholm, there you might only have two, which would not be a big enough number to have a meaningful impact on the quality of life in those areas.
The information that or the material that I read regarding short-term rentals, some of the things I pulled off the internet, seem to suggest that the negative impacts for a community would come from non-owner occupied short-term rentals. That's going to be the things that are going to disrupt the sense of community much more than an owner-occupied short-term rental. So that's one point I wanted to make. The other thing, getting back to the previous discussion regarding the IRS difference between bed and breakfast and short-term rentals, Carl, could we use the IRS definition of what those are in our ordinance to specify the difference between the two?
Yeah, we could certainly look into that information. And I know in some of the literature that the chair had provided, there was a lot of talk and discussion in that literature about taxes. And I think that's kind of where you were coming from, Chair. And I mean, I could pull that information up and we could go through it, but it's a pretty long document and we'd probably be swimming in it for a little while. But I think this is another question probably better posed to the city attorney to kind of suss out for us and determine whether or not, make sure we're on good legal ground here with the direction that we're trying to go. And I don't see why we're not, but again, that's more for the attorney to kind of figure out for us, I think. So I'll add that to the list here. IRS definitions of STR and B&B. Okay. So I've got this up here, sort of non-owner occupied, Millville, Finholm, downtown, or whole city. That's kind of I think that's sort of the big question on everyone's mind. And I think something to keep in mind too is that there are other ways, you know, to and I'm not advocating one way or the other, but there are other ways to limit the numbers of these within a particular area, you know, either through a limitation on the number of them by zone, by street, within, you know, a certain proximity to one another, kind of like we've done with the transitional housing and permanent supportive housing and emergency shelters, with that sort of proximity idea that they can't be so close together. And I'm just throwing that out there because it's further in this draft. We, you know, have some of those provisions in there, and there was definitely some of the commissioners discussed those. And you know, we definitely heard it from some of the comments as well that we read. So so Chair, I think should we just continue to move through this document at this point, even though we're sort of hung up on maybe the prime underlying components of this, one of the major building blocks, but I think we still need to kind of get through this and see where we agree and where we don't, and where maybe there's more questions. And I feel like running through that exercise might, you know, enlighten us on some of these other questions that we've got.
Sounds good.
Okay. Oh, Commissioner Krosnick has his hand up. Are you? Okay.
No, Carl, I just forgot to.
Oh, okay.
Just forgot your word.
Okay, so we had I kind of haphazardly threw together an intent statement here, and you know, if anybody has any thoughts on that, I think that's something that we can probably come back to down the road when we get closer to having something ironed out. That was my thought anyway. I don't know if there's any question or thoughts around either the intent statement, the applicability statement, or the exemptions. Applicability needs to be ironed out just a little bit more, obviously, particularly since we're not entirely sure what this ordinance is going to apply to. So that'll definitely get sussed out more, and that's why it's a little bit thin at the moment. And I suppose the same is true of exemptions.
Commissioner Soltis, go ahead.
Yeah, Carl, I have some suggestions on how to write that with a little less emphasis on the tourism part and more of an emphasis on providing a reasonable set of regulations and definitions about STRs as being the true intent of this. It seems a little tourism heavy to me as a lead-in for the whole section. And I think we could kind of focus more on protecting the overall livability and historic quality of our community, and what we need to do if we're going to accommodate STRs, how to do that and balance both things out. So it's just kind of more of a, I'll just share it with you later in a sidebar. It's just maybe a reorganizing of that, so the intent is a little bit different.
Okay.
Commissioner Soltis, Brown.
I agree with that. I think we don't want to say that we're trying to strike a balance between tourism and the rights of residents. I think that's the wrong point to aim for. I don't think tourism should have nearly as much of an influence here on what we're doing as the rights of the residents.
Yeah, I would say well stated by both of you, and I agree with the point, you know, that the fabric of the community and the historic nature is what makes Gig Harbor special, and it is our intent to protect that while making sense of an STR ordinance. Poorly worded, but you get the point.
Oh, no, well said, well said.
Okay,
Commissioner Grina, you haven't had much to say so far.
I'm just thinking.
Okay,
I mean, I'm trying to listen to all these different points and I really think kind of what Carl said, I think as we move further down here, some of the definitions that we're going to come up with or restrictions or whatever may have a big impact on what we were just talking about, if
Okay.
that makes sense.
right, all right. Thanks. Commissioner Brown, did you have an additional thought or
Oh, I'm sorry.
no worries? Okay, go ahead, Carl.
okay, so I'm just making a note about applicability here. That's going to kind of depend on where we land on owner occupied, non-owner occupied, as well as the difference between bed and breakfast and short-term rental and where we want to limit them. So we'll come back to that. Exemptions, lodging. So I said that lodging uses meeting the definition of short-term rentals and legally existing prior to the adoption of this chapter shall be considered. So this is it's trying to kind of get to the idea of if we are moving forward with a short-term rental ordinance, we have certain properties that have already been legally established. So they're in essence non-conforming if this ordinance were passed. And so how do we deal with those? And some of the jurisdictions have dealt with those by placing sort of a limitation on the number of years that they would allow for that nonconformity before they had to bring it into conformance. In other words, come in with a short-term rental permit if we had a formalized short-term rental permit. And so, and I think that I pulled this from maybe either a couple jurisdictions, and I think there might have been a couple commissioners even that kind of had some ideas about this. And so what I stated here was that if it was legally existing prior to the adoption of this chapter, it would still be considered legally, it would be legally non-conforming for a period of not more than 2 years. After 2 years, the short-term rental use would be considered abandoned unless the owner has applied for a short-term rental permit consistent with all applicable regulations of this chapter and other applicable local, state, and federal codes. So I was trying to kind of capture that in a nutshell there in some manner. Any reaction to that idea?
Yeah, I have, what's legally, what are the legal requirements that a bed, STR is followed up to this point? Does that mean getting an application through the city? That's the only legal thing that's been done, that 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 so far?
Yeah, that's correct, Commissioner Soltis, but only depending on the zone. So some zones that lodging level 1 is permitted without needing any kind of permit. And in other zones, it's a conditional use permit. So in some cases, we don't have any kind of, there is no sort of permitting for the use. It's kind of like a home occupancy. You know, they would get a business license. They would get registered with the state and jump through those hoops. They would get a local business license. And then as long as they're meeting the definition of a home occupation, then it would be legally established within the city. In other zones, it would require that they get a conditional use permit. And those are some of the ones that we're reviewing or have been reviewing here recently.
What if they didn't get a business license from the state or the city? Are they still legal?
No, they would not be legal in that sense, no.
Wait, sorry, I wondered, not more than 2 years. I mean, 2 years seems like a pretty long amount of time to me to be non-conforming.
It is kind of a long time, Commissioner Grina. And the reason I put 2, I can't remember why I put 2 years in there. It could be, it could be 1 to 2 years. I suppose it depends on whether or not if we're having a renewal requirement as part of the permit. So where my mind was going when crafting this was that we have a short-term rental permit that needs to be renewed every 1 year, maybe it's 2 years, depending on where we landed on this. And so if it were 2 years, then those that were already established would get that same period of time that any new legally permitted STR would have before they needed a renewal.
Okay.
Certainly, if there's, other thoughts on what that should be, I don't think that there's any kind of, as far as I know, there's no legal precedent for that.
And so this statement would essentially allow all current existing short-term rentals to exist without any permitting for the next 2 years as is. And then at that point, 2 years from the adoption of this code, they would then require getting a permit if they meet that. If they're currently operating a STR that doesn't meet any of the code within here, they're still allowed to operate it over those 2 years. Is that right?
That's correct, Commissioner Bennett, as long as they were legally established. And so the way that would work is that if there were complaints, let's say from the neighborhood about a residence that was clearly conducting a short-term rental, and they made a formal complaint to the city, and we investigated it, we would be looking to see, and they said, well, we're running a short-term rental. Okay. We would then look and see if they were legally established, and if they needed a conditional use permit, that would be a very easy way to figure that out. And the other way would be to see if they had a business license. And if they do have a business license, then we would still be looking to ensure that they're not giving any kind of outward appearance of running some sort of business from their home.
So I think one of our goals is to make this process easier and significantly quicker. And so I agree that 2 years sounds like way too long. And I would like to see that cut at least in half. Because, some of this should be online if we're going to, especially if we're going to take away the conditional use part of it altogether, then it makes it really easy. And I don't see any reason to allow that 2-year grace period. It doesn't make any sense to me.
One consideration I have in that, because that's what I was thinking of too, if 2 years seemed too long, because I have seen that in other jurisdictions. The concern I would have there are the people who are currently operating STRs, perhaps legally, that someone has a full house, if it's considered a major source of income at this point, or something like that, it gives them a chunk of time to figure out what the next step is if that's not going to be allowed to be a source of income for those people. Is that something that would be a consideration? Is 1 year enough to say, sorry, you can't be doing this anymore, if this is the money that you've been making as your source of income? That's kind of my biggest concern, is cutting people off too soon if this is something that is their part of their livelihood, or their that they need to have these, and they have been up to this point, and then all of a sudden it's cut off. How much time is enough to be able to cut that off for them?
I
don't see
agree.
it as cutting them off.
That was my rationale for thinking that 2 years would be acceptable to make the transition.
Well, that's a great point, but I think there's two. I guess we're thinking of two different scenarios. I'm thinking of the person whose intent is to continue to do this, and they're going to be in an area where they're going to be allowed to continue to do that, and they're not going to pay their fee for 23 and a half months because they don't have to. But I appreciate your point, but I think we can address both of them separately. Commissioner Soltis?
I was just going to say that I would think that if someone's non-conforming, the first thing they're going to do is to put their application together and submit it to the city and become non-conforming. And waiting 2 years to do that is, I don't see, unless Amanda has that point about there's some kind of income issue, but if they got a STR and they want to keep running the STR, then they'd run down and submit their application properly and they would continue to operate and they had the same income they had before. So
I'm concerned though, if we end up going with the no non-owner occupied, and you have someone who's renting out a full house per se, that is no longer going to be an option for them, that would be cut off. Something on a larger scale where they're getting more money for it than a single room, something like that. And I don't know how many full houses we have versus rooms here in Gig Harbor, but something along those lines, I think would be my concern. If they're running something that seems fairly legit right now in terms of short-term rental that you would get on an Airbnb or something like that, that has been allowed up to this point, and then all of a sudden our restrictions are going to become that much tightened and they're no longer going to be allowed, is that enough time for them to figure out something else, sell their house, to have to do something if it's not something that they can keep doing legally conforming after the code takes place?
they could sell in a week, Amanda. It seems like these days. I get your point, though. I see it's two different things. I got it.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. And I think that's kind of one of the issues with this is trying to figure out if, and it really does kind of, again, I think we have to come back to this probably at some point after we've figured out some of these other issues. And then I think this might become more clear at that point, depending on how, which way we go, short-term rental permit, or whether it's, just using the conditional use permit process currently, or whether, we end up landing on some sort of zoning restriction and or proximity restriction or something along those lines to limit where and how many short-term rentals could be in the city, or the non-owner occupied versus owner occupied as well. That's, I think, a really good point. Okay, and I'll do a little more research on that as well and see if I can figure out if there's any kind of legal precedents. Okay. Okay, so this one, oh, sorry.
Could I just say, I am absolutely opposed to any concept of grandfathering in a permanent sense.
How about grandmothering?
So in our speak, we really only deal with, a lot of people use that term grandfathering, and it doesn't really exist in zoning code, because grandfathering sort of gives the sense that it would never go away no matter what. And that's not necessarily true. If the use is abandoned for a certain period of time, say a year, or if somebody intentionally changes a structure, demolishes a structure, they can lose some of those non-conforming rights, and then they have to bring it into conformity. So, but what I'm going to say is that you're opposed to legally non-conforming use in perpetuity under current code. Okay, I think that captures it.
Right, but I'm just one voice, so the
True.
if anybody, please speak up if you don't agree with that.
And I think, Chair, I think that's what, I was trying to get to here, was making sure that we don't have that sort of situation, because I don't think anybody wants that. Again, depending on where we go, if it ends up being a conditional use permit that we require in certain zones to permit these, well, some might already have a conditional use permit, and therefore they are legally established. So there is no nonconformity in that sense.
Well, Carl, couldn't we get clarity and specificity on what has been legally permitted to date? We keep dancing around this, saying it's 1, 2, or 3 or whatever. There must be someone whose job it is to keep track of how many non-owner occupied dwellings there are here, huh?
Michelle, we have that number, I believe. Michelle, you're muted. If you're talking, we can't see you, so we don't know.
Thank you. Sorry, the dog was freaking out. I was trying to wait.
Oh,
I
okay.
I have a list of business licenses from the Department of Revenue that I kind of had to guess if that use was a short-term rental or not. And we made a list from, but most of them aren't licensed. And I went back through every single permit and archives, finding ones that, possibly got a conditional use permit for a short-term rental, but never applied for a business license. Most of them don't have business licenses, so they're not paying the taxes.
What we do know, I'm sorry, Michelle.
That's okay. They're just not paying the taxes for lodging.
But we do know that we have, and all we really can tell for sure is that we've got, I think it's 5 that have gotten conditional use permits for
Or are in the
lodging,
process.
or are in the process. I think it's a total of 5, right? So maybe only 3, Michelle, am I right on that? 3 that actually have the conditional use permit, and maybe 2 that are in process?
Yeah.
And
Which when
do
they
we
get the
know-
conditional use permit, they get inspected from building and fire to make sure that they have the proper entrances and smoke and CO2 detectors.
And do we know whether they're owner occupied or not?
The ones that we have conditional use permits for, yes. Because that was stated on their permits, if they were having a whole house rental or if they were just renting rooms.
So of those 3 that we just mentioned, how many of those are whole house rental, non-owner occupied?
I think only one is owner occupied. The other 2, they live out of state.
And do we happen to know where they're located? Are they in the View Basin or elsewhere?
We have 2 that are on Ross, and I can't remember off the top of my head where the other one's located.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So Carl, if you got a conditional use permit approved, could you still not be paying the proper taxes to the city and the state?
Well, I think that wouldn't happen today, but it was likely happening previously. We weren't, I don't think the city wasn't doing as good a job previously on keeping track of business licenses and business license renewals. And now we are doing a much better job, and we have a much better system in place. And Michelle can speak more to that because she's really in the thick of it.
Mhm.
But if someone were to get a conditional use permit, there wouldn't necessarily be any follow-up on our part for them to get that business license the way things are currently set up. They get the conditional use permit, they would then, I think now, knowing what we know about STRs and with the focus that we have on them, we would likely make that a condition of approval for them to go and get the business license, and then they would have to do XYZ in order to legitimize that business, but we didn't really have anything like that necessarily previously. So, you know, this process will legitimize a lot of that for us. And the other thing, you know, that and we're bringing up a good, you know, some good points here about is that these things are very hard to track. It's very difficult to determine how many of these we actually have in the city. I mean, you can go to any of these sites, Airbnb, VRBO, those are the two that come off the top of my head, but there's about 20 of them out there probably that you could go to and put in any number of dates and come up with different numbers for how many are actually here. And it's also difficult to tell if they're actually within the city limits or just have a Gig Harbor zip code, which incorporates, you know, encompasses, as you all know, a large swath of land and area. So there are companies that do this work, that track it. Staff has sat in on a few of these seminars with a couple of these companies to try and figure out how many there are in the city, and they won't give us any written data necessarily, but they'll tell us based on their research, because they're trying to sell us a product, how many we have here. And the number, you know, comes down to roughly an average, roughly around 58, including boats. And whether or not those are owner occupied or non-owner occupied, we don't really know that. But those are things that we probably could figure out, and these companies could probably do for us. And you know, these companies will take care of depending on the money you spend, they'll take care of permitting, enforcement, regulating, making sure we're getting our taxes. You know, they take care of all that stuff. And there's different modules that you can buy. I mean, it gets pretty complex, and you know, the price tag keeps going up and up, of course. But that, you know, that might be an option if we felt the need for something like that. But you know, I guess my real point here is that it's very difficult to tell what we have. It's kind of hard for us to tell what we have permitted, because we just, you know, we don't know for sure. And I think, you know, there's probably a lot of these operating out there that people aren't really even aware that they're operating as such, or they don't care. I don't know. I don't know which. Okay, I'm going to move into, so the categories here, 17.xx.030. Again, I was really, you know, trying to spitball here, trying to read everyone's comments, look at public comment, and try and kind of figure out a way that, you know, that we wanted to look at these. Now, of course, we've already started talking about a difference between owner occupied and non-owner occupied. And so maybe based on that conversation, if we went that way, none of this would really matter anymore, with the exception of, you know, I suppose this category 3, where we have duplex, triplex, fourplex, multifamily liveaboards. If we're talking about non-owner occupied versus owner occupied, I don't exactly know how we deal with those. They're a little bit their own animal in some ways, I think. So a couple of questions in here. If let's just say that we were taking this at face value and we were okay with these 3 categories. And so here I'm going to say, my first question to you all was, is there consensus on allowing all categories of STR? I'm going to say no for now, because I think that is the consensus. That's the feedback I think I'm getting so far. Definition using the state definition, so I just made a note of that. Restriction on if we were to allow even owner occupied, so category 1 I've got here is SFR and or an accessory apartment owner occupied. So this would be really more our wheelhouse at the moment, and kind of where we're all leaning. must be occupied by the owner for at least 6 months during the calendar year with no more than 3 bedrooms rented at any one time. That's coming right out of that definition that we were using earlier and that we may try and eliminate potentially, depending on what Daniel says, the city attorney.
And that's where you cross over into the bed and breakfast definition.
Yeah. I think so. And then there was some discussion about restriction on the number of adults per bedroom. I think in Commissioner Brown's, I believe it was in Commissioner Brown's, and maybe the chair's thoughts that you would limit it to 2, if I remember correctly.
What I was reporting was that quite a few municipalities seem to limit it to 2 adults and up to 2 children per bedroom. That seems reasonable to me.
It might be reasonable, but how could you possibly assess and control something like that from a regulatory point of view?
I think it's a really good point, Commissioner Bradbury, but I think that's true of a lot of what we're coming up with here. In essence, I think a lot of this is very hard. It's going to be very difficult to administer and very difficult to enforce, and it does create some potential issues for staff when and if we get complaints about these places, and trying to substantiate those complaints could be very tricky. Could be very tricky.
Well, I think that's the point, Carl. It's going to have to be a complaint-based enforcement system.
I think so, Commissioner Kroslick, and that's how we handle things today. And I know that there is some feeling out there that maybe we should be less complaint-based, maybe a little more proactive. But we don't, currently we don't have the staff necessarily to do that. I mean, we have enough complaints coming in that, trying to be proactive on things is difficult as much as we would like to.
Commissioner Grana?
So I cited a bunch of things out of Sonoma County, which is where I used to live before. And I think that by saying like 2 people per bedroom, 2 adults and 2 children, I think that that's important because it helps set the qualifications for the people renting it. Because when you went to the Sonoma County thing, what it did is it brought up things that said, if you're thinking of renting a short-term rental, here are the things you need to consider. And it was really for the end user, actually. So by putting these in, I think it's not necessarily as much about enforcement as people, what am I trying to say? People renting it, the right kind of people renting it for the right kind of reasons. If that's not quite, I'm not saying it exactly right, but hopefully you know what I'm trying to say.
It sort of provides some expectations.
Right.
Yeah.
Mr. Bennett?
I'm gonna have to leave here pretty soon, but I just want to put my final 2 cents in before I leave about my concern with going with omitting all non-owner occupied, which would be that second category tier, just because that would really get rid of all whole house rentals. Me coming from a family with children at this point and thinking of, in-laws or friends coming out to visit or something like that, that really omits a whole typology of group in terms of rentals. And I wonder if that's something, do we really truly want to not have an option for an entire house rental here in Gig Harbor? Or are we only offering up rooms within occupied homes? That's something that I feel like if I had family coming in from out of town, I would want them to be able to find a whole house that they could actually rent out for a short amount of time if they were coming in for a week. If they didn't want to stay in a hotel or something like that versus staying in one room in someone's house or two rooms in someone's house where they're being occupied. Perhaps I might be of the minority in this group because I'm a little bit on the younger side and still in that realm, but I hate taking away that option for the entire city. And maybe there's places where that is a better option and places it's not a better option in terms of zoning or what have you. But to me, it still seems fairly viable. And that's all I have for now.
Thank you. Have a great time with your kids. Commissioner Brown. Actually,
Well-
Commissioner Soltis had his hand up for a little bit.
I was just gonna weigh in on the two guests per bedroom plus children. I think the Gig Harbor Short-Term Alliance had that in there, and I agree that's a good thing to put in the performance standards for this. And if this is the right place for that, okay. But we also probably are going to be thinking about the performance standards category as maybe a standalone piece of in our document. So it could go here, it could go there, it could go both places. But I do agree at the point, putting it in here somewhere.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Brown.
If the definition is 6 months of occupancy by the owner, then during the other 6 months, I assume they'd be free to rent out the whole house. Am I wrong about that, or is that not the case?
Yeah, I think that's the case, Commissioner Brown. That's how I read that.
All right, so then there are two places that a person can go to rent a whole house. One is from those folks who are going to vacate their house for the 6 months of the year or some part of that time, or they can go to a whole house rental outside the town boundaries. So I don't see that as a really onerous restriction at all.
Thank you.
Does that mean there's two different definitions of owner occupied? There's owner occupied and present, and then there's owner occupied and not present? Would those somehow, in terms of your tiers of an owner being on site versus an owner being off site?
No, I think owner occupied means that they have to be in the house. I'm starting to think that maybe I've got this wrong here, because I'm saying must be occupied by the owner for at least 6 months during the calendar year with no more than 3 rooms rented at any one time. But I believe the definition fewer than 3 rooms. Yeah, I think I may have that, but I may have that mixed up. This definition is just so confusing. I wish I wouldn't have put it in here. Because I don't think then that actually qualifies as a short-term rental. So it wouldn't actually, if this were true, must be occupied by the owner for at least 6 months during the calendar year, that wouldn't actually meet the definition of a short-term rental. Therefore, it wouldn't be considered under this ordinance.
Wait a minute.
So then to Commissioner Brown's point, if that's true, then yes, they could rent the house out for the other 6 months of the year, but they couldn't rent it out as a short-term rental. They could rent it out as a long-term rental only.
No, no, that's not the point I was making. If I qualified as a short-term rental for my residence, and I decided that I wanted to go live someplace else for 1 month, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months of the year, I could still rent my place for less than 30 days at a crack as a short-term rental. Well, isn't that what we are thinking of?
Yes, that's what makes sense to me, but I but I think that this disclaimer that's in this definition, and everybody correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but this disclaimer to me means that if you have a house and you're the owner and you're occupying it for 6 months or more out of the calendar year, then you would not qualify as a short-term rental.
I said it before, I think we ought to get rid of that definition.
Yeah, I know.
I think it's too subtle in some ways. But just to clarify it, I think that what we want to permit is people who are residing in their homes for at least 6 months a year to rent out 2 bedrooms on a room by room basis for those 6 months. And then when I'm not in residence, to rent out the entire house for less than 30 days at a crack. And I don't see a problem with that. I mean, we could argue about whether 6 months is the right number, whether 2 bedrooms is the right number, but to me, that all makes sense. And I think there will be people who will want to do that.
It's an and statement. So it's saying a dwelling unit that is occupied by the owner for at least 6 months during the calendar year and in which fewer than 3 rooms are rented at any time. That is not a short-term rental. Meaning that if they're renting out the whole house for the other 6 months, it's a short-term rental. That's what that's saying. I just had an epiphany. I hope there's not many people who are watching or listening in tonight.
Yeah, I've been reading that over and over again myself, and that's a tough one.
But I think Commissioner Brown is correct. I think what you're saying is correct, Commissioner Brown. I think I'm understanding what you're saying there, but
Okay.
so if it's going to be an owner-occupied short-term rental, then this is correct. To be considered under this current structure in this ordinance, to be considered owner-occupied, the owner must live in it for at least 6 months with no more than 3 rooms rented at any one time. So in those other 6 months, they must be renting out the entire house, thereby, or 4 rooms, thereby meeting the definition and falling under this short-term rental category 1.
Or not renting at all.
Or not renting it at all. But if they want to be a short-term rental, then they have to meet this definition, these provisions.
But I think we need to say not just rooms there. I think we need to specify bedrooms. Because without specifying no more than 3 bedrooms, then they're not there and they're renting the whole house, and that includes the bedroom, which is a room, another bedroom, which is a kitchen, which is a room, a living room, which is a room, a dining room, which is a room. So I think we need to add the specificity of a bedroom.
I agree.
Again, part of the intent is to control the amount of traffic flowing in and out of a single dwelling unit.
Yep. All right. I made a note of that there. I think that's a good addition. Okay, this next one, restriction on the number of units, and these would be owner occupied. Do we want to tackle this right now, given that we may want to go away from owner occupied altogether, or do we want to talk about this? Or have we sort of beat that horse to death at this point?
No, this is a key element, and unfortunately, I will not be around to discuss it because I'm going to have to sign off here in just a few minutes.
Michelle, if
you
Commissioner
want-
Bradbury leaves, will we still have quorum?
The other way?
I will have to double check. I believe 4 is still majority, or 5.
Yeah, I think we only need 4. Can you double check that really quick, just to make sure we don't
Yep.
violate the bylaws here?
So Commissioner Bradbury, if you would please give us your thoughts then before you have to leave, I'd appreciate it.
Well, as I inferred a little while ago, I think it is important for us to place some kind of a limit on the total number of short-term rentals with a specific emphasis on whole house rentals and non-owner occupied whole house rentals. Those to me are the core element of what we're talking about. And I would like to be able to define some number or percentage or distribution of those types of units. Those would be business units specifically, which we would want to bring under our control as well.
So what restriction would you propose or be the most comfortable with?
Since we're talking about the specific city limits, and those city limits are essentially built out, I would want to put a specific low percentage in there. I don't know how many housing units that we're talking about, but we could determine that. And maybe that percentage is no more than 1 or 2% citywide.
Would you favor a distance between as well, or?
Yes. Yes, I would not want, for example, in my little cul-de-sac, I would not want the opportunity per ordinance for, say, 2 housing units on my little cul-de-sac to be short-term rentals. And so, you know, if I looked at my area, in fact, which has probably got, I don't know, let's say 150 housing units within my general area, I would be comfortable with a restriction on 1 out of 150, for example, to put that kind of a number on it.
Mhm.
The only thought I have with that, and I did include in here, limited to 10% of total residences within a particular zone or within a particular area, is that, and I made a note here, is that that would be, it'd just be very difficult to track, I think, and difficult to administer. I just don't exactly know how we would do it unless we were, constantly considering the number of housing units that we have within the city, which we can do, we could do, and maybe we should be doing, but we don't do on any kind of daily basis. Something that we
Wouldn't
look
that
at.
be part of the permitting process?
You mean put it on the applicant to figure it out?
Yeah, conditional use permit.
We could.
I mean, I don't know the logistics of it. I don't know how to put a definition on this that can actually be managed in a reasonable way. But I think that needs to be discussed. We need to be able to come up with some kind of a reasonable restriction which would allow people to do this as a business opportunity and bring tourists into the community without letting it get out of hand.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah,
the whole point of this ordinance, in my view.
I'm certainly not saying that it's impossible, because it certainly can be done. I mean, we have we have that data, and we can, we can get that data. We can certainly update that data. And we could manage something like that through GIS, for instance, between GIS and our permitting software. It could probably be done, or it could be done probably by one of these companies, one of these third parties, could probably do that really easily. That's probably something that they already do. So yeah, certainly, if that was the direction that Planning Commission wanted to go, that's something we could look into. Like you said, what are the logistics of doing something like that? What is the feasibility of doing something like that? What's the cost of doing something like that? I think those are probably the big questions.
Exactly.
Commissioner Krosik?
Yes, couldn't we accomplish the same thing by placing distance limits? So for example, you can't have a short-term rental more than 500 or 1,000 or 750 feet next away from another short-term rental.
Yeah, Commissioner Krosik, absolutely. And I included something like that in here, limiting the proximity of the units to 300 feet or 1,000 feet, something along those lines. Again, we would need to have some way for potential applicants. We'd have to have some way of determining that. Again, we can do that. I mean, that can certainly be done through a GIS layer. Mike Simmons, our GIS wizard, could easily have these things mapped for us. And we're trying to get to a point where our permitting software is synced up with our GIS data, so that would be a really seamless thing at that point. That would be very easy to do. So yeah, I think that's certainly another way to handle something like this. You could also handle it by zone, and say only so many within a particular zone. By area, I think there's endless ways to think about this. Just a matter of, I think, preference and feasibility from a staff or administration standpoint.
I'm going to need to go, but again, I think this defining how we want to restrict this is absolutely core to developing this ordinance.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, Commissioner Bradbury. And I would, it strikes me that the simplest way for it to be adjudicated and monitored and enforced is with distance. Because as Carl has said, it just seems too difficult otherwise. And it might, and that's why I asked my question to you, Commissioner Bradbury, is that not just a percentage, but so you have 3% in a given neighborhood, but if those three houses are all right next to each other on a small cul-de-sac, that's not very favorable for the other three houses on that small cul-de-sac.
Agreed. And distance could be a manageable way to define that without putting any kind of a gross number or percentage on it.
And the other thing I would guess is that it would significantly shorten the timeline of people's getting up to code in much less than 2 years, because if they know there's a density restriction of some kind, they want to get their foot in the door first.
Yep.
So that would be a natural stimulant to foreshortening that timeline that I think is too long.
Good point. And with that, I'm going to need to sign off. And so I would presume we'll pick up this again at some point next week with our next meeting.
Yeah, and the other thing, it's 7:01 now, so you will have the opportunity, this will be up on the city's website, so you can just roll the tape all the way through to the 2-hour mark, and you'll be able to hear the rest of the discussion.
Okay.
So, and I would hope that you would do that as well as Commissioner Bennett.
All right, with that, I will sign off. Everybody have a good evening, and we'll speak again soon.
All right, thank you. Okay.
Okay, so one more question then on this, in the same vein then. We're talking, we've got this restriction on number of units here. This is under what I've got as category 2, single family residential, non-owner occupied. And the reason for that was because, obviously I think the thinking is that the non-owner occupied version of an STR has the greatest ability to create some kind of nuisance. We're thinking that, an owner occupied, you're probably going to have there's less likelihood that you're going to have the big party, or that the trash is going to be unkept, or things of that nature. And so are we, I guess, is the commission concerned about this number or this limitation on units in the same way with owner occupied short-term rental?
Commissioner Kozik?
Yes, I think there is an issue there because it's going to be, there's going to be parking issues and other sorts of things that are going to come up. So I still think that the distance between even owner occupied short-term rentals is still something. Now, maybe we could shorten that distance a little bit in those cases, but I think it's still important.
Any other thoughts on that? I would agree with you, Commissioner Krosick. I just, it may be a shorter distance, but I still think that there needs to be separation.
I agree with that.
I do as well.
And it sounds like most of the commission is interested in some kind of separation, sort of by proximity, some kind of number, 300 feet, or by block, or 1,000 feet, or something along those lines.
And again, the Sonoma County documents that I provided, they say 1,000 feet from the property line of any other existing or proposed, in this case, it says non-hosted short-term rental, which I think seems like a good starting place.
But we are still considering prohibiting non-owner occupied short-term rentals from the town, right?
Right, I was just using this as an example of the wording, actually.
Oh,
1,000 feet is a pretty long way. That's like how many houses in between point A and point B? How many houses are we talking? Is it, that could be 5 houses worth or 8 houses worth, Carl? I mean, if you're going down a city block.
Yeah, well, let's say average 50, 70 feet.
For a frontage.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty big distance between, you have to kind of really get some pretty bad actors at 1,000 feet to be a problem. I mean,
Well, see, it goes back to the, higher population density and smaller streets in downtown. I mean, it addresses that by not coming out and saying it, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 1,000 feet is far. But, I don't know if it's unreasonable. I don't know. Sonoma County didn't think so.
And it's
So-
pretty dense there too, so.
Well, we can debate that, I guess. I'd like to get at this, Carl, your third category, if we had a chance to talk about that,
Mhm.
if I could for a second, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Well, let me just ask you quickly, Bob, what number did you have in mind as far as separation? You don't seem comfortable with 1,000.
I think like, 500 feet would be like 5 houses or something like that, if I do my math halfway decently. I just seem like 1,000 feet, then you're just scattering. You're not gonna be able to have too many of them at all in the community. And if that's your intent to really limit the community, then okay. But if your intent is to protect a neighborhood from over concentration of STRs, then I think you probably could accomplish that with a smaller proximity limit.
Yeah, well, I just a little bit of perspective. So you're strolling down Harbor View, and in the course of a mile, you, if it's 1,000 feet, then in a mile you will come across 5 STRs.
Mhm.
So does that seem like not enough? So that's, I try to, put some perspective of how I can, feel about these things.
Well, 5 per mile is, that's pretty spread out. Yeah, and I don't know if your distance goes like from the back of the house to the next block, how that would be applied, or if it's only down street. Could your neighbors behind you be a problem if you've got, 1,000 all directions, that's a pretty big circle.
Mhm.
And maybe we don't mean that.
Yeah, what are the other folks' thoughts? Because I'm inclined to agree with you. It probably doesn't sound like it, Bob, that this 1,000 may not be the right number. But I also don't think 300 is the right number.
Carl, when you do a proximity thing like that, is it like, are you drawing a circle from all, are you extending a line from all 4 sides of the property?
It depends, so for a development where we're looking for, let's say, critical areas, we would kind of you'd have a center point essentially in the parcel and look for 300 feet, around that. That's kind of what we would look at. If you're looking at like a mailing where we have to mail out to properties within 300 feet of a development, then we use the boundary and we draw a bubble out around from the boundary of the property. But if we're talking about, for instance, parking and allowing someone to park off-site or to provide their parking at an off-site location, they can do that within 500 feet of the property. And we do that based on, just a straight line, essentially from the property boundary to wherever it is that they choose to put that parking. So we kind of do it in different ways depending on what we're looking at. But we have the ability with our GIS and mapping system to do it, any of those ways.
You know what you could do, Carl, is you get your GIS guy to map the ones that we actually know about and put a circle around it or a line around it and see what's available, what's left in the city for new STRs.
Okay.
That's an excellent suggestion. And while he's typing, to continue my analogy of earlier, is that so at 500 feet, you would stroll a mile and there would be 11 STRs.
Yeah, well, and that sounds like a lot.
Do we care how far apart they are if they're strictly renting 2 bedrooms, say, and not renting the whole house.
And that was the point that I was making, Commissioner Brown, kind of asking about is, whether or not we care if it's, if we're only considering owner occupied, then does that have a, does that make a difference?
Well, yes, because owner occupied can still rent their house, rent the entire house for those months of the year that they're not going to be in residence, right?
Correct.
But I could also opt maybe to get a different kind of permit or license that only allows me to rent 1, 2, or 3 bedrooms.
Right.
And then
I
would
think
it
that's
matter
very-
whether would the distance restriction matter if that were the case?
Tom, I like your idea about a different kind of permit for those situations where somebody may be going away for 30 days and then rent their whole house. Maybe we do need to consider that that would be a different category.
Yeah, I kind of think it could be. And I prefer to make this as simple as possible, but maybe we ought to keep that distinction in mind and see if that doesn't solve some of these problems.
So it would be another category whereby someone lives in the house half-time and rents it out the other half-time? That's what we're,
No, one category would be a renter who does not wish to ever rent out the whole house. They're happy renting 2 bedrooms. That's it. And then maybe for those folks who are owner occupied and just renting out the spare bedrooms, there would be either no distance restriction or a longer distance, a shorter distance restriction, right? I'm not sure I'd care if the person that lives on my cul-de-sac, or if 2 of the 10 houses on the cul-de-sac were renting out 2 bedrooms and never renting out the whole houses, I think I'd be perfectly happy with that.
I'm about to have a little problem here, unfortunately. My computer is rebooting and I have no control over that. It's something that the IT department sets up, and I've tried to shut it down a couple of times here. And now it's given me like a ticking time bomb. So I'm gonna have to, I have to drop off, it'll reboot, and then I'll jump back on. I'm really sorry about this. I've got this all saved and I can pull it back up pretty quickly.
Okay. How long will that take?
The reboot won't take long at all. It's already rebooted. I think it just needs to shut itself down and start up. So it's basically a restart.
Okay. All right.
Sorry about that.
No
We'll talk
problem.
about you while you're gone.
Dang it. Every time this happens, that's just like high school.
Okay, Commissioner Grina.
Okay, so because I do this kind of stuff a lot, so I did like Google Earth Pro and I pulled up my street, which is 1,200. My neighborhood is 1,200 feet long, and there are 21 houses there. So if you were to say, if you didn't go with 1,000, the problem is you can't look at all neighborhoods the same way because some neighborhoods are far more dense than others. And so again, that's the reason why I think 1,000 feet is good. But I just wanted to bring up that, there are 21 houses within 1,200 feet on my street. So I'm just using that as an example. That's a whole lot different than a neighborhood where the houses are more spread out.
Yeah, thanks.
That is a good point.
Well, that's why I think, the suggestion of having Mike, do an overlay for us will be informative. Uh-oh, no, I don't have the reference material.
Oh, Carl left.
Yeah, he'll be back.
Hey, Greg, I could talk one issue here while we got all of us here. He's got a category 3 that includes hotels and liveaboards,
Right.
and hotels, I think, or maybe that's wrong, apartments, and then duplexes, triplexes, all that. I think that's good to add that in there, because that is a problem in some other cities where they rent a lot of apartments out of buildings as STRs. And so they get a lot more transients.
Right.
But I think splitting it into liveaboards and apartments is probably better, because they seem like they're two very different beasts, and we could disposition liveaboards pretty easily and maybe spend a little more time on the apartment ones. But it seems to me there are two separate categories, and maybe that might make sense.
Yeah, I don't know, and maybe you do, Michelle. Are there apartments anywhere in Gig Harbor that are occupant owned?
I don't know about apartments that are occupant owned.
So, and I guess,
I think most of them have people they hire to take care of them.
right, so it would really be kind of a condo if you owned it. Although I know that there are places where you can actually buy an apartment and it's not necessarily called a condo. So I
I
don't
think they
know
just
how,
call them apartments, because when you own a condo, it's from the walls in, and somebody else owns the outside of the structure, which is usually the HOA.
right. How is that different from an owned apartment?
That's, I'm saying, I don't think there's much difference, because you own from the inside walls in. If you own an apartment, they just don't call them condos.
Okay, so I still, having said that, I don't know of any such beast in Gig Harbor.
I don't either. I know there's condos.
Right.
And the condominialization process is done through the county, not through us, because it's a recorded document with the county.
Uh-huh. And then most of those have, well, I think all of them, they have to have a condo association and bylaws and all that jazz and, the regulations.
Yeah, to maintain the outsides and the roofs and
Yeah.
the yards and all the common areas.
It wouldn't surprise me if most prohibit STRs within a condo complex.
A lot of, all the ones I know of do. I'm not gonna say they all do, but most of the ones I know do. My parents just bought into a 55 and older condo association, and that was one of the very strict things. You cannot sublet or short-term lease your condo.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Welcome back, Carl.
Thank you.
So, all right.
And just a reminder, if we go past 8 o'clock, we need to vote on that.
Right. Thank you.
Oh, it's the wrong thing.
Well, while we're waiting, I'd like to make a few remarks about liveaboards.
Sure.
There's two types of liveaboards that we see in Gig Harbor, at least. One is an owner occupied boat, and that's regulated by the state and by the county. And it's limited to a certain number of slips per marina, so that I couldn't live on my boat because there are 0 permitted slips in that marina for liveaboards. Okay. My belief is that owner occupied boats don't represent any problem that's on our list of problems we're trying to solve here. I don't see that it's something we need to regulate. The other type of liveaboard is a short-term rental, and we've got a number of those in the harbor. We've got a fleet of houseboats at Pleasure Craft Marina. I don't know how many, but maybe half a dozen or 10, and a couple of other boats that are advertised as short-term rentals. It's such a small number, and it's so different from a dwelling unit, a housing unit, that I would recommend we just leave it alone and not address liveaboards or living on boats at all. I think we'll confuse people and without achieving anything of value. End of comment.
Okay, thanks. So Carl, with respect to, does a person who lives on their boat at Murphy's Landing, do they live in the city of Gig Harbor or not?
Yeah.
Yes, they do.
So how far out does that line stretch? Kind of right to the middle of the harbor, if I remember from the map?
It stretches across the harbor. We annexed the entire harbor a few years back. I can't remember what year that was. Just maybe right when I got here, until 2015, I think, maybe just before that. But we stretch all the way across the harbor now to the property line of the parcels on the East Bay.
Right, and so none of that actually goes, at least none of that actually touches land on the other side.
Correct.
At least at high tide. So
Correct.
I'm visualizing that map now. So okay. So I see your point, Commissioner Brown. But I'm wondering if part of our intent is to keep the peace in the neighborhoods, as it were, and protect everyone's interests, should we exclude the folks that are trying to live peaceably on their boat when the boat next door to them on either side has a continuous carousel of STRs coming and going?
Well, that's a good point. But we have no evidence that there is in fact a problem at those marinas. And I certainly have never observed a problem. And I've never seen a short-term rental in any of the marinas, except for the houseboats that are moored at Pleasure Craft. And I guess there's 2 boats that are advertised down at Gig Harbor Boatyard as short-term rentals.
Yeah, I think that varies up to 4 at times, but don't quote me on that. Yeah,
Could be.
Commissioner Krosick.
Do we want to include the liveaboard rentals so we can collect the hotel motel tax on them? Is there any taxation issues or money that isn't going to be coming to the city if we don't include them?
Good point.
Yeah, that is a good point. Which this may or may not be the place, but I don't remember seeing it in your document, Carl. But I do have strong feelings that people should be required to only rent through a third party, like Airbnb, because then the city is assured in getting to get their all their proper taxes and fees and stuff.
I agree with that.
Let's see, that was, so if I did have that in here, it would have been in the general provisions down here. One. Here's another limitation. Well, we haven't gotten there. I won't go down that rabbit hole. Let me just look for this one thing. Talk about listings for short-term rental units should include the short-term rental permit number. Guest logbook, off-street parking, such a manner, sign, short-term rental. No, I don't think I do have that in there. So that's something that if commission wants, we would add that. It would be something we'd add into general provisions because that would apply to any use. So the thought is that it would be a requirement that they advertise on some STR platform.
Yeah, a third party site, Airbnb, VRBO, whatever. Because then Airbnb sends the, sends the taxes right to the city is the way I understand it.
Yeah, that is the way it is set up to work. I guess, talking with some of these companies that do some of this work, like Granicus and a couple others, they say that they've gotten better. It hasn't been perfect in jurisdictions actually getting those taxes or getting their fair share of those taxes from those companies, but apparently it's been getting better. I think maybe one of them had alluded to a lawsuit with Airbnb that took place or something, and so it is getting better. It's not perfect, but certainly better than what we've got right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very important as well, and I'd like to see that included. I think that also, I think a lot of these groups that rent out that manage these short-term rentals also have certain standards that they expect their property owners to adhere to. So I think that's another reason to require that.
Yeah. Okay.
So really quick, back to liveaboard. So what was, is there any kind of consensus on this category 3? And in that, maybe you guys talked about this a little bit before I got back on, but duplex, triplex, fourplex, multiple family, imagine also a situation where we have just an apartment maybe in a commercial building or a mixed use building where we have commercial and residential, and somebody, maybe the owner of the building or a tenant in the building, wants to sort of sublet that space and turn it into a short-term rental, or the owner of the building wants to turn that one apartment into a short-term rental, that kind of thing. Or, the duplex, triplex, fourplex, that's fairly obvious what that would end up looking like.
I think liveaboards needs to be separated from, I mean, it can be in that section, but I don't like it in the same grouping as duplex, triplex, fourplex. I mean, that's just it seems like a completely different animal, and it doesn't feel like it belongs there to me.
I agree. Hey, Greg, I'm dropping off for just a minute. I'm gonna re-sign in. I'm on some kind of weird page that I can't get back at the group. So I'm gonna drop off and come right back.
Okay. I think we'll have to suspend the discussion then, Carl.
Let's see, we would be at 4. No, I think we're still okay.
Okay. Oh, that's right.
Yeah, we're still at a majority. Michelle texted me and said that she checked the bylaws just to make sure that it wasn't a majority plus 1 or something like that.
Oh, I'm back. Sorry.
Oh, wow.
I don't know
was
what
like
happened.
That was like time travel. Okay, so should be maybe categorized differently, or
Just another
or are you thinking that it shouldn't be a short-term rental at all?
no, I think it belongs for the reason that Greg was talking about, but
Hmm.
I just don't like that they're all in that in that same grouping. I don't know. I think it's just the way that it's set up that's bothered me, and I'm not sure what it is, but
Well, and we would, the way this would go is, I think, anyway, if we went with these different categories, my thought is that they would be defined. We would have,
Right.
we would create definitions for them in a separate location. So this sort of grouping here wouldn't be here. It would just be short-term rental category 3. And then any provisions specific to category 3 would fall under here. And of
Yeah.
course, there would be liveaboards would be there. So they would be grouped together kind of, but it wouldn't read like this necessarily. If
gotcha. That's helpful.
I was
Carl,
just,
while you were gone, I suggested we break it into a 3 and 4. Liveaboards be a separate one, and the apartment multiplex, that'd be a
Oh.
separate one too. So just that, break it into 2 would be cleaner for me. Liveaboards is a small subset, it's a small part, but it makes sense to keep it separate because it is very unique.
oh, okay. So that's where you were going, Commissioner Grina, then. So
Yeah,
that sounds like that's kind of where you were headed too.
it is.
So create a cat 4, which would include the mixed use and liveaboards.
So 2 separate categories, mixed use and then liveaboards. A D, I guess you'd say.
Okay, so a category 4A and a category 4B. Is that what you're saying? I'm sorry,
I'm sorry, I was just trying to say, instead of ABC, do an ABCD, and then D is liveaboards, C is your mixed use, 4-plex, 3-plex, stuff like that. Very different beast.
Okay, so I'm just going to say create a new category for liveaboard. A new cat for mixed use. And then duplex, triplex, 4-plex, multifamily would still fall under this category C or 3, whatever it looks like.
That'd be my proposal.
I agree.
And again, this might all change if we go away from a non-owner occupied version at all. Then, well, it would just change the numerology, but not really change what it would be.
So how do we then, now the distance restriction becomes a real conundrum to me, especially in the liveaboards, because I think the Gig Harbor Marine or Gig Harbor Boatyard, I think specifically has them kind of a bit perhaps off by themselves. 3 or 4 of them tightly clustered together with the specific, and well, I shouldn't comment on the intent because I don't know what the intent was, but I'm making an assumption. But wherever that you would have liveaboards in a marina, I mean, let's face it, marinas are tiny, and none of them are 500 feet long that I'm aware of in Gig Harbor. And then I think, about an apartment complex. And I specifically think about, like Rebecca Shores, which is down here, if you're not familiar, down here at the head of the harbor, in Gig Harbor. And so someone comes in and buys that thing and decides to convert the entire building to short-term rentals because it's more profitable, which I don't think is that far-fetched. I mean, it's right on the water. So, and I think they could make more money by converting all of those apartments to short-term rentals. Is that something that we would be
All
comfortable
under
with?
hotel, wouldn't it? Because it's more rooms and they've all have their own exterior access.
What's
thanks.
what's the definition of a hotel based on room numbers? I don't know. I'm asking.
So yeah, that's where I was going too. Thanks, Michelle. That's again, we have these lodging levels. Where's my definitions here? And a lodging level 2 means an establishment providing sleeping accommodations with the majority of all guest rooms having direct access to the outside without the necessity of passing through the main lobby of the building, with or without food services, and may include conference facilities.
So
And
then,
then lodging level 3 is similar, but with a majority of all guest rooms having direct access through the main lobby of the building. So that's the difference. Lodging level 2 was set up to be a motel, and lodging level 3 was set up to be a hotel, and lodging level 1 was set up to capture the bed and breakfasts, because that's what they were dealing with at the time. So
that answers my my lifelong ignorance of the difference between a hotel and a motel. So a motel
Eureka!
is the classic highway, you can
Yeah.
see the door. And then when you've made enough money, you go to a hotel and walk through a fancy atrium to get you your room.
Yep.
Well, I learned.
And I think this is bringing up a really important point, because I did put in here duplex, triplex, fourplex. I did put in multifamily. Maybe multifamily would never end up in this. Would never be. I guess the way I was thinking about it was a situation where you had an apartment building, and the owner wanted to rent out certain units as short-term rentals, while the rest of the units would be, the hotel motel. I don't know if that's, I'm not even sure of the legality behind that.
Yeah, so if there's not a number in that hotel definition, it would say that a fourplex where all of them are rented out as STRs by definition is a hotel.
Potentially.
Okay.
Except that.
Chair, I would suggest that we put that on a kind of a more research area on how to deal with apartments.
Yeah,
And
good idea.
do a little background looking at some of the other information we've seen from other cities. Other cities have, like, the bigger cities with more apartments probably have had to address this.
Good
I've seen some
suggestion.
videos about it.
Why don't we move on and try to make some other decisions?
Okay. I will definitely have to do some more research on that. It's as if we almost need an entire code section, a lodging code section, which we currently don't have.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll do that. Do we want to jump into the general provisions then next and kind of hammer through that a little bit?
Sure.
Okay, so questions. That's not the right one. Okay, that's the one we just added. Okay, so short-term rental permit approval shall be required. So this is another one of the, I think, one of the main questions and pieces that we have to ask ourselves. Did we lose Commissioner Brown?
No, he's still there.
Oh. Oh, sorry, Commissioner Brown. I just need to change my, just had you all in a row and I didn't see, couldn't see everybody. Whether or not we want to use the, the current conditional use permit process for these, or whether we want a new, propose a new permit type. Whether we want different processes based on the category of the short-term rental. For instance, I just put this out as just a kind of, for instance, should a category 1 even require a permit? Should it be more like what we have now, where in some cases, it's by zone. So in some cases it's permitted outright. In other cases, we need a conditional use permit. Oh, and I did have this here, Chair. I said contract with a third party for permitting and, oh no, that's with one of these other companies like Granicus or something. So that's just a question about whether or not that might be something that Planning Commission wants to put in their recommendation when it goes up to council. So something we can talk about later when we finally get this all ironed out, but I just didn't want to lose the idea.
Some kind of permitting would be good to keep track of fire inspections, though.
Say again, Michelle, I'm sorry, what did you say at the beginning of that?
Some kind of permitting would be good to keep track of fire inspections.
Agreed. Just safety inspections in general. And for tracking purposes, because to the point we were making earlier when Commissioner Brown asked how many of these we might have in the city, and our answer is we don't really, we don't know. It's kind of a guess. And we only have a couple of them that are actually permitted, and we don't have business licenses for a majority of them probably. Having a short-term rental permit or registration or something along those lines would then allow us to track these over time. Also, if we want to have any kind of annual review of them like we do with food trucks, then we would need some sort of permit associated with the business.
Carl, if you have, if something is simply permitted, can you still, as part of the permitting process, ensure that they have a set of performance standards that they have to meet as part of that basic permitting process? AKA what the Gig Harbor Short-Term Alliance suggested, here's a set of standards we would agree to adhere to. So can that be part of the permit process without going through the conditional use aggravation?
Well, sure. If we created a new permit type, if we created a short-term rental permit, then we could determine how that permit is processed and what what the decision is on that permit. So we have different classifications of permits within our code. We have a type 1 that is just completely administrative. So the director makes the decision on that permit. These are land use permits. We have a type 2 permit, and type 1 doesn't require any kind of noticing and doesn't have, the only appeal of that permit is judicial to Superior Court. Type 2 permit does require some notice, requires a notice of application, and requires let me see, is it hearing examiner on that one, or is it? No, decision made by the director on a type 2 as well, but the difference is that you have a noticing period at the beginning. And then you could have an open record hearing before a hearing examiner if it was appealed, if the permit gets appealed upon approval. Type 3 goes to the hearing examiner for a decision. That's what a conditional use permit is. That falls under type 3. There is a notice of application and there's an appeal before the hearing examiner as well. And then so on and so forth. Type 3, and we have a type 4 where the council actually makes a decision. Type 3A, hearing examiner. Type 5, which is legislative, so different.
I think we want to go something more streamlined than type 3 or 4 or 5. I think 2 is probably where, if you can have a couple of conditions added into the process, because I really don't think this should be onerous on the applicants. I think maybe the reason it's been, you know, I'm getting a sense that maybe some of the STR owners found it to be too hard, so they didn't do it. But if we could do it, make it so that we get what we want and it's still faster and easier, then we ought to kind of find that happy place.
We could
And
do
know
a hybrid
Michelle.
between like we do for food trucks and type 2 where it's noticed so that neighbors are made aware that this is happening in their neighborhood.
Yeah. Thanks.
Noticing is going to be important, so that almost puts you in that type 2 area already.
Yeah, I think at a minimum, it should be a type 2.
And
But it
that's
doesn't-
exactly what I was going to say, what Michelle said. You know, I like the idea that it's noticed. I think that's super important that it's got to be in there.
But what we lose by not having it as a type 3 is that we don't have there's no public hearing. With a hearing examiner, you have a public hearing. So with a type 2, it's just an administrative approval. Unless appealed, and then it would go to the hearing examiner for a hearing under type 2.
But here's a bit of the rub. So that for the applicant, that adds time and expense. And I would be willing to bet that of the few that have gone through the process, that every single one of them, the hearing examiner approved. Even if someone was speaking up against it. And so it is my belief that if we craft this properly, this ordinance, and we have decisive and significant financial penalties for infractions, to provide the incentive to do it properly and not try to fly under the radar, then that's where we can perhaps strike the happy medium. You know, maybe there's an area in the city where conditional use might be most appropriate, but I'm not sure about that. Commissioner Krasik, you have your hand up.
Yes, I think it's really important that we keep the process as simple as possible to encourage compliance. And Greg, I totally agree with what you're saying about having stiff penalties for non-compliance. I think both those things are really important.
I agree with both of the last two comments.
Hey, Carl, when you guys set up conditional versus permitted for the matrix that is currently in the municipal code, why did you differentiate some areas to have conditional use versus some that were flat out permitted?
Because the conditional use permit has more stringent criteria that must be met by code. So we have certain criteria that the applicant actually has to meet and prove to the hearing examiner that they can meet that criteria in order to get the permit. So it's a more stringent process. And in some cases, it might be a use that is maybe not as compatible in that zone as potentially some other uses, and therefore might require some more strict conditions in order to assure that the use does not create any kind of nuisance conditions or any kind of incompatibility or inconsistencies with surrounding uses.
But you just did that for residential 1, 2, and 3, I think. Maybe another 2 or 3. Everybody else was permitted more or less. I'm over speaking here, but in general. And if STRs are considered to be kind of like innocuous little things that just happen and you never even know that they're there, maybe we got a little over carried away with the conditional use categories.
So are you looking at the
matrix?
The matrix that I provided?
Well, the one that the Gig Harbor Alliance provided with their markups. I would presume that they were showing markups against the one that's in the municipal code today. I guess what I'm getting at, guys and gals, is that it doesn't seem like we should differentiate between different zones in the city. If STRs are something we consider legitimate uses, then let's just push it into the permitted category and get the right level of permit put in there. And let's not go to this conditional use, because I don't think this is really going to be a problem unless it's something egregious done. And then there's always probably going to be ways to get at it.
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, if the ordinance states you have to have off-street parking, you know, all these things that we're talking about, it is my belief that if it goes to a hearing examiner and you have punched all those buttons, that he is going to approve it every single time. I mean, he's a lawyer, right? You know, he's a, I believe so anyway, he's a hired lawyer that doesn't even live in Gig Harbor is the way that I understand the hearing examiner process. Is that right, Carl?
Correct. Contracted attorney.
Right. So the couple times that I've been to the hearing examiner fussing about things, part of my frustration was that and I say he because it happened to be he each time, was not a Gig Harbor resident. So they are invested in the law and the strict interpretation of the law, and they're not invested in the very things that we're talking about here, to, you know, with the purpose and intent of this ordinance. So I just don't see how the conditional use process makes it better.
Not to interrupt, we are approaching 8 o'clock.
I just want to read the conditional use permit criteria to you. And I think I'll read the intent statement as well really quick when I get there. So the intent of conditional uses: certain uses, because of their unusual size, infrequent occurrence, special requirements, possible safety hazards, or detrimental effect on surrounding properties, are classified as conditional uses. These uses may be allowed in certain use districts by a conditional use permit granted by the hearing examiner, subject to the procedures established in Chapter 2.25 Gig Harbor Municipal Code. And so then the review criteria. Each determination granting or denying a conditional use permit shall be supported by written findings of fact showing specifically wherein all of the following conditions are met. That the use which the conditional use permit is applied for is specified by this title as being conditionally permitted within and is consistent with the description and purpose of the zone district in which the property is located. That the granting of such conditional use permit will not be detrimental to the public health, safety, comfort, convenience, and general welfare, will not adversely affect the established character of the surrounding neighborhood, and will not be injurious to the property or improvements in such vicinity and or zone in which the property is located. That the proposed use is properly located in relation to other land uses and to transportation and service facilities in the vicinity, and further that the use can be adequately served by such public facilities and street capacities without placing an undue burden on such facilities and streets. Lastly, that the site is of sufficient size to accommodate the proposed use and all yards, open spaces, walls and fences, parking, loading, landscaping, and other such features as are required by this title or as needed in the opinion of the examiner. So they have to meet all of those criteria or show that they're consistent with each of those criteria in their permit application. And so those are the criteria that staff is reviewing a proposal against. And then we're making a recommendation or a staff report to the hearing examiner based on our own review of that proposal. Now, we also, for accessory apartments, we require a conditional use permit in not all zones. They're permitted in some zones, but in an R1 zone, let's just say an accessory apartment does require a conditional use permit. In the same chapter 1764, we have another section regarding review criteria for accessory apartments. And so there are some very specific guidelines in here for accessory apartments under the conditional use permit code as well. And they are specific to accessory apartments. So we do the same for wireless communication facilities. So that's another way, I guess, of looking at this. And again, I get your points that, well, if we're creating this whole ordinance, that this kind of does that for us. I think it does and it doesn't. And in some ways, what it doesn't do or what it wouldn't do if we didn't have a public hearing associated with that permit type, not saying across the board, just saying in certain instances, is it doesn't give the public an opportunity then to have a final say over how they feel that criteria is or isn't being met. Because we'll do a notice of application, people would provide us comments, and then we would go through the permitting period or the permitting review, be back and forth. There might be changes in the permit, certain things are changed. We would add some conditions, and then the director would sign a decision. And that decision, then there'd be an appeal period, and people could appeal that decision. They could appeal that decision to the hearing examiner if it were type 2. And then there would be a hearing in that case if that person who appealed had standing to appeal the permit.
But you got a single family residence that's going to be turned into a short-term rental. It's still a building where people are going to live in. It's not, nothing has substantially changed other than you're going to bring people in less than 30 days for visits. What's possibly going to change about the neighborhood that would, I mean, other than the fact that you don't want it next to you, but what is changed in terms of the danger or the problems that are associated with this whole thing? It's not like you're putting in a brand new kind of thing where it's like a prison next door or a car dealership. It's the same house. It's just being used for a different purpose.
Yeah, and I just need to interrupt here for just a second. It is 8:01. So for us to continue the discussion, which I think is appropriate for some period of time, I would need a motion for us to continue the meeting. Otherwise, we're required to adjourn.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm ready to call it a night here, so I will not support a motion.
I am as well.
Okay,
So then you won't have a quorum, so, correct?
well, there's no motion unless Commissioner Soltis wants to put a motion out to continue the meeting, then there has to be a motion to do that.
I see the handwriting on the wall.
And we can continue with this on the 21st. We have penciled that into the agenda.
31st, I believe.
21st.
21st of April would be the next meeting. We have a hearing next week on the transitional housing, supportive housing.
Is that
So-
6 PM then?
Michelle,
Next Thursday?
That
Michelle?
is correct. It will be at 6 p.m.
6 p.m. next Thursday. Shoot. Okay, well, this was a really good discussion. I liked where we were headed there. But I get it. I'm tired too.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, so I think you kind of covered next meeting.
Yeah, that's right. Next meeting will be the public hearing for the short-term rental, or sorry, no, permanent housing, permanent supportive housing, emergency shelters, and emergency housing again. And I will go back and do some of the research that we talked about tonight and have that at the ready for the 21st. And maybe have some other ideas based on some of the discussion that we had here tonight for the 21st.
Yeah, if you could have the listing of the different permits, I mean, I think, or tell us where to look that up, that would be helpful.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. I know this has been hard, but this document will live forever, and we need to get it right the first time. Because there ain't no turning back. And so anyway, I appreciate everyone's work and everyone's time, especially since this was an extra meeting to begin with.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and Carl, if you could just stay on for 1 minute after everyone else is off, I'd appreciate it.
Certainly, Chair.
We do need a motion to adjourn.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
So
I move
moved.
we adjourn.
Second?
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Thanks, everybody.